On this week's NESN Patriots Podcast, we discuss who could take Isaiah Wynn's spot on the roster, and we look forward to this week's preseason game against the Carolina Panthers. Hey guys, it's Doug Kyed here, and before we get into our regularly scheduled podcast, I just wanted to note that this was recorded before the Patriots released Kenny Britt. So if you hear us say anything about Kenny Britt as if he's still on the roster, then that is a very good reason why. And if you're wondering why we didn't discuss Kenny Britt's release on the podcast, and that is also why, I'll just give a quick take on the Kenny Britt release. It does come as a bit of a surprise that the Patriots waited this long to release Kenny Britt. He had not practiced since June, or he hadn't been a full participant in practice since June when he did hurt his hamstring. It seems as if with the third preseason game really on the horizon and Kenny Britt still limited, the Patriots had really just kind of had enough and realized that it was better to cut bait at this point than to keep him on the roster. It certainly opens up a roster spot for another Patriots receiver. I think this increases the chances that Eric Decker makes the roster. Decker has definitely struggled during the preseason, during training camp, but I mean, the Patriots only have so many wide receivers on their roster. I think it also increases the chances that someone like Braxton Berrios or Riley McCarron could make the roster as a slot receiver and punt returner. If those guys don't make the roster, then the Patriots are really only left with Julian Edelman, who suspended the first 4 games of the season, Chris Hogan, Philip Dorsett, Cordarrelle Patterson, and Matthew Slater. I don't think I'm missing anyone in there. Hogan, Dorsett, Patterson, Slater. You wouldn't think that would be enough players. So, yeah, I would certainly expect someone like either Decker or McCarron or Berrios to make the roster. At this point, it's possible the Patriots could bring in another receiver from outside the organization. I know the Patriots fans are pretty much obsessed with Dez Bryant at this point, but and there's only so many weeks left in the preseason during training camp for a new receiver to learn the playbook. And someone like Decker, I think the reason why he's still unsigned is that he wants more money than teams are willing to give him. I'm not sure if the Patriots will suddenly spring to action and give him the contract that he desires, especially since they do have limited cap room that they need to carry into the regular season, and that they'll probably want to carry over even into the 2019 season. So I'm still not sure that Dez Bryant or Jeremy Maclin or some of those guys who are still out there are the best fit for the Patriots. They could swing a trade before the season begins. We've seen them do that in the past when they acquired Keyshawn Martin or even Doug Gabriel, if you want to go back to 2006. The problem with that is that players like that rarely make much of an impact. We saw it last year with Philip Dorsett, who only had 12 catches after he was acquired in early September. So I think there's definitely some risk involved with signing a guy right before the season begins, because suddenly then they have to learn on the fly. So really, I think the Patriots might be better off sticking with someone like Decker, who has at least been with the team in training camp, or the younger guys like Berrios or McCarron, or even if you want to go even deeper into the roster, Devin Lucien or Paul Turner. And I think that, you know, the Britt release, we did expect him to possibly be a starter on the Patriots if he ever did get healthy. So I would say that this means bigger things this season for guys like Dorsett and Patterson, who are locks to make the roster, and they'll certainly be a big part of this offense through the first 4 weeks of the season while Edelman is serving that suspension. But maybe the biggest winner of all would be Chris Hogan, since he is going to be the number one option over the first 4 weeks of the season. So with that out of the way, enjoy the rest of the podcast, where we will recap the Patriots Week 2 preseason game against the Eagles. We'll look forward to the Week 3 preseason game against the Panthers, and we will discuss Isaiah Wynn's injury and what kind of repercussions that has on the Patriots roster. So if you hear the name Kenny Britt and we're talking about him like he's still on the roster, we're not morons in this instance. It is because we recorded the podcast before he was released. Enjoy the show. Welcome to this week's NESN Patriots Podcast. I'm Doug Kyed, joined as always by Zack Cox. Zack, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Doug, how are you?
I'm doing well. We are sitting around right now waiting for Tom Brady to talk to the media, so I would assume he's not going to say anything too outlandish that would force us to re-record this podcast, I'm willing to take that risk today.
Yeah, I think that's probably a safe risk.
Yeah, it's the preseason. Brady is not probably going to say much. So let's get right into things here, though. Recapping last week's preseason game against the Eagles. Since it is Wednesday right now, it's been almost a week since that game. We won't get too far into the dirty details there since we wrote all about it. And, I mean, I would trust that you guys read all of our stuff about that game. If not, then I'm highly offended. But Tom Brady got his first preseason action, and he looked like Tom Brady.
He did. Yeah, Tom Brady, he spoke yesterday on WEI. He was kind of critical of performance, said he felt a little bit rusty, and I mean, I guess he missed a couple deep passes in the game, but I mean, what was his accuracy when you take out drops and throwaways? It was like 87%.
Yeah, 87.5%.
Tom Brady looked like Tom Brady in this game. I mean, he might have said that he looked rusty himself, but overall, this was basically as good of a performance as you could expect from Tom Brady in this preseason game.
It always strikes me as such like a cocky thing to say for Brady.
I only was accurate on 87% of my throws, guys.
He goes like 13 of 19 with 2 touchdowns, 172 yards in one half. He's like, yeah, I was really rusty out there. And like, yes, some of the deep passes weren't great, but he was kind of getting pressured on one of them. No interceptions. Receivers possibly could have fought for some balls more. So, yeah, I mean, he was, 70% or 60% on his passes anyway. Accuracy percentage was way up there, so nothing to worry about with Tom Brady.
One thing that I did wish we saw a little bit more from Tom Brady was him throwing to some of these new guys that he's going to be throwing to this season. Most of his targets and completions were to guys like James White, Chris Hogan, Julian Edelman, guys that he's worked with for years now, and we aren't worried at all about his kind of chemistry and cohesiveness with them. Didn't see him work a lot with Eric Decker. He worked a little bit with Cordarrelle Patterson, had one pass to Jacob Hollister, but mostly it was those established guys in there. Maybe that will change this week against the Panthers since he is expected to play deeper into this game, so maybe they'll try to work some of those new guys in. But yeah, it was mostly status quo against the Eagles.
Yeah, and it'll be kind of telling if he doesn't target a lot of the new receivers against the Panthers, because then I think the Patriots will be relying heavily upon James White, Chris Hogan, maybe a little bit of Philip Dorsett, but obviously Rob Gronkowski.
Yeah, we'll surely see a lot of Rob Gronkowski, who didn't play in this game.
Yeah, he didn't play on Thursday night, so we'll certainly see a lot of him. Let's get into White a little bit. James White, he looked as good as ever, I thought, in the game. He had, I think it was almost 100 total yards in that game.
92 yards from scrimmage in one half. Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, he was like really heavily relied upon in the first half, but he was targeting him, he was handing the ball off to him, getting some of those draws that he usually does pretty well on. So, I mean, I don't think we're going to see a huge jump out of James White. He's been a pretty consistent player ever since his rookie season, but James White was James White in that game.
Yeah, and I think you could see an uptick in usage for James White in those first 4 weeks before Julian Edelman comes back, especially if none of these receivers kind of elevate from what they've been really showing in this preseason. There hasn't been really anybody from that group that's jumped up and showed and kind of said, hey, this is a guy that we can really look for the Patriots to kind of target heavily while Julian Edelman's out. So far, it's looked like basically Chris Hogan, who actually hasn't even really played that well this preseason, and obviously Rob Gronkowski's going to be in there. But James White's a guy that you can really move all around the field. The Patriots have used him in the slot. They use him in the backfield. He can run the ball, catch those screen passes. And you really saw, like you said, the kind of full spectrum of James White's game and potential against the Eagles there. So I definitely think that he's a guy who has been a huge part of the Patriots offense over the last couple of years. I think you could maybe even see that grow a little bit, especially early in the season.
Yeah, and especially with some of the injuries at running back right now. Rex Burkhead is banged up. Sony Michel's got the knee injury. So if those guys are still, a little bit limited when the season begins, then maybe James White will be even more heavily relied upon, because there was games last year where he disappeared for a little bit, and it was just because the Patriots were relying so much on Rex Burkhead and on Dion Lewis. Yeah. So
especially because he's never been a guy who's going to run for 80, 90, 100 yards in his career. He's got to be involved in the passing game to really be involved on that score sheet.
Definitely. Cordarrelle Patterson.
Oh, you got it.
I nailed it. So I have less trouble with Ho'omanawa Nui than I do with Cordarrelle Patterson, but I think I've got it now. There's apparently a hole in my brain where his name resides, or should reside. But he looked good. He had 2 screen passes where one of them could have gone for like a 50-yard, 60-yard touchdown. The other one did go for like a 11 12-yard touchdown. Really was showing off his moves after the catch, what he can do after the catch, how shifty he can be. But there was also I don't know if it was a drop, but ball where he could have competed a little bit better. He's going to be an inconsistent player this year, but I think that he also has major big play potential, which is something that he basically said to you guys on Sunday in the locker room.
Yeah, he said, I'm a playmaker, man. I make plays. That's all I do. And he is a playmaker, as he showed. This is kind of what we've seen from Cordarrelle Patterson throughout his career. He's incredibly dangerous with the ball in his hands. He on that 11-yard touchdown, he just made one move, and Sidney Jones, your boy from Washington, just flew right past him. He basically just jogged into the end zone. So he's incredibly athletic. Like we've talked about before, he's been making these ridiculous catches throughout training camp, throughout the practice in the summer. He almost had another one of those against the Eagles, which probably should have been a touchdown because he burned Jones deep down the field. Brian Hoyer hung the ball up there. He had to kind of attempt to make an acrobatic catch over the cornerback, and he wasn't able to do it. But again, like you said, he had a drop. He had another play where he slipped on a route and it resulted in an incompletion. He had another one where early in the game, you couldn't tell if it was an errant throw by Brady or kind of a little bit of a miscommunication on a route. He ended up getting blown up by Malcolm Jenkins and getting a penalty from it, so it ended up turning out well for the Patriots. But yeah, he's never been a consistent wide receiver. He's never been a complete wide receiver. He's not a guy that's going to run these kind of underneath routes or intermediate routes. Really, he's really basically screen passes, jet sweeps, and deep balls. And if you're okay with that, then he can be a very dangerous weapon for this team. But you have to have the number of weapons around him to kind of fill in all those other holes. Luckily for the Patriots, they should have those, even with the kind of question marks in the receiving core. But I mean, I think if you get games like that from Cordarrelle Patterson all season, I think the Patriots have to be pretty happy with that.
Yeah, he might almost be similar to, I guess, Malcolm Mitchell in his rookie year, where Malcolm Mitchell had big games and kind of disappeared other times for the most part. We might see big games out of Cordarrelle Patterson, but he also might kind of disappear for some stretches. Not to say that those are similar players, but they'll probably have similar production. I wouldn't be surprised if Cordarrelle Patterson had 400 receiving yards by the end of the season. Let's get one more positive out of the way before we dive into the biggest negatives from that game against the Eagles, and that other positive is their pass rush. Patriots pass rush has really been on fire in the preseason. They had 8 sacks. The big winners of the day, I thought, were Derek Rivers and Adrian Claiborne. Both of them had 6 total pressures. Adrian Claiborne was really kind of bullying the Eagles' offensive line. And then Keontae Davis also had a nice productive game where he had 1.5 sacks. He didn't do a whole lot against the Eagles' starting offensive line, but just the fact that Keontae Davis was starting in that game, I think, was a positive enough. And then he really did do a good job of getting some pressure against the Eagles' backup offensive line. So there's still some work to do there with Keontae Davis, but he's an interesting sized player. He's about 6'4", 280 pounds. He can rush from the inside. He can rush from the outside. And it seems like the Patriots like him. So him getting 1.5 sacks in that game, I think, kind of solidifies maybe what the Patriots were seeing in him coming into that matchup.
I agree. The fact that he got the start over Derek Rivers because Trey Flowers, who would usually be starting in there, is still out with that injury. He played a ton of snaps. He played well. I mean, this is a guy, Keontae Davis, who a lot of Patriots fans probably don't know much about because he didn't play at all last year. He went undrafted. He played at an FCS school in Chattanooga. But we talked to Bill Belichick about Keontae Davis within the last week, and he said he most definitely would have been drafted if he didn't have that bulging disc in his neck that made him miss all of last season. And he probably would have been something around a mid-round pick. So this is a very talented player. Now that he's healthy, he's got good size, like you said. I think he's really in line to make the roster right now and potentially even make an impact in that defensive end rotation. Once Trey Flowers does come back, I think he's going to get pushed down probably to the bottom of that list behind Flowers, Dietrich Wise, who am I forgetting? Adrian Claiborne, Derek Rivers. But
Adam Butler's
in there too. He's the guy that can kind of bounce around to a couple different spots on that defensive line. But yeah, I mean, from what we've seen from Davis so far, he was even running with the ones a little bit earlier in training camp. So it does seem like the Patriots really like him.
Getting into the negatives was the young cornerback play in that game. The worst was
not good.
Keon Crossan, who the Patriots they were using him as their starting slot cornerback, and not to be too mean, but there were times when it looked like he'd never played cornerback before. He was flagged twice for defensive pass interference, once for holding. One of his defensive pass interference calls was one of the most egregious penalties I've ever seen.
He basically tackled DeAndre Carter.
Yeah, he chopped at DeAndre Carter's arms about 5 seconds too early, maybe. It was a ridiculous amount of time too early to be doing that. But Jamal Wiltz, who's another kind of slot type cornerback, also got burned multiple times in that game. J.C. Jackson, undrafted rookie, was burned on a 57-yard deep ball where he did a pretty good job of keeping up with the receiver on the play, but he didn't do anything in terms of trying to break up the pass or do anything at the end of the play. He was just running down the field with the receiver and did nothing else. It did not appear to seem like he knew that the ball was coming. And as far as, I guess, older cornerbacks on the roster, Jason McCourty was burned for a 4-yard touchdown where he bit on an inside route. The wide receiver wound up going upfield to the end zone, and McCourty couldn't get his footing in time to recover. So overall, pretty negative game for the Patriots cornerbacks, and really it just opened up a lot more questions that we had about the cornerback group in general, because the players who didn't play in that game, which would be Ryan Lewis, who was an undrafted rookie last year, Jonathan Jones, who was a Patriots slot cornerback for about half of last year, and Cyrus Jones, the 2016 second-round pick. Those guys probably came out of that game looking better than the other players just by not playing.
As well.
Yeah, Duke Dawson, the 2018 second-round pick as well.
Yeah, so this game was kind of a proving ground for some of these young players because those 4 guys that you mentioned did not play. All of them are roster bubble players. Or I guess Duke Dawson will most certainly be making this team as a second-round pick, but he's kind of fighting to actually have a role on this team. So yeah, this was a big opportunity for guys like Crossan, guys like Jamal Wiltz, guys like J.C. Jackson, and none of them really stood out. I mean, I'm curious with what they're trying to do with this slot corner role. I think they're just kind of keeping it warm until Jonathan Jones comes back, because Wilt started there last week, Crossan started there this week. Neither of them have played particularly well so far in the preseason. That was a really bad game for Keon Crossan in this game. He had a play last week too where he leapt about 5 seconds too early, completely whiffed on a pass breakup, ended up being a 58-yard gain down the field. So he's a guy that we talked about coming out of the draft, that he was an incredible athlete. He's super fast, super shifty, but he just looks like he doesn't have those coverage instincts yet. I think he's a guy that could definitely benefit from some time on the practice squad, which looks like that's probably his most likely destination right now, because I can't really see him or Wiltz making this team right now. J.C. Jackson still has a better chance because he has been playing well in practice, but I haven't been impressed with him in either of these 2 preseason games. So who knows if the Patriots would give the edge to him over a guy like Cyrus Jones, who has that punt return ability, even though he's never really kind of put it all together at the NFL level. And then with the starting lineup, I mean, Stephon Gilmore is going to be in there, but is Jason McCourty going to beat out Eric Rowe for that other spot? So far, Rowe has looked better, but he's also gotten a lot more opportunities. I'd be interested to see how they handle that this week. I mean, if I were them, I would line it up basically for most of that game. Just have Jason McCourty on one side, Eric Rowe on the other side, which they did for a little bit of that Philly game last week. Because you know what you have in Stephon Gilmore. He's already in there. You really don't know which of these other 2 guys is going to emerge, and it could be a situation where if Jason McCourty doesn't win that starting job, he might not have a role on this team because he's a little bit more kind of one-dimensional than some of these other younger guys.
Definitely, and I think that Eric Rowe has really not done anything to lose that starting spot. If the Patriots were going into the summer with Eric Rowe as that other starting cornerback in mind, I think he's been targeted 6 times. He's allowed 2 catches for about 20 yards
he's been
in
good
the preseason.
So far.
He's got a couple of pass breakups. He's really doing everything they needs to do. So as long as that keeps up over the next 2 weeks, I would expect him to be that other starting cornerback. And in the slot, I mean, like you said, maybe they're keeping it warm until these other guys get healthy, because really their top slot options it would be Jonathan Jones, Cyrus Jones, and Duke Dawson, all of whom haven't played, or all of whom didn't play in the second week of the preseason. So I think that, once those guys get healthy, then that slot picture will become a little bit more clear. And in those first couple of games, it really just seemed like they were like, all right, let's see what we have out of these guys, because there really wasn't, they didn't do enough to show that they
would make sense. But even those guys, those three guys you mentioned, none of them are really sure things right now. Jonathan Jones is the most accomplished NFL player of the three, but he had suffered an ankle injury, which reportedly was a torn Achilles about 6 months ago.
Yeah.
So, which really doesn't really give all that much time for him to kind of get back in with the kind of player that he is, how fast he is. Who knows if he's going to be completely 100% at the beginning of the season. So you might see a lot of moving parts in there, I think.
Definitely. Another negative from the game is Isaiah Wynn suffered a torn Achilles. That's another word that I kind of suck at pronouncing. I think
you go Achilles?
I think I've said Achilles before, but
Achilles Smith.
But but then I think I was on TV one time and my friends were watching and they made fun of me for saying Achilles. So now every time that word comes up, I'm like, Achilles. So yeah, Isaiah Wynn did suffer that Achilles injury, and this has some pretty major trickle-down effects on the roster. First of all, Patriots have to decide what they're going to do about their backup offensive line now, because Isaiah Wynn was probably going to have a pretty big role as a backup offensive tackle, possibly as a backup offensive guard. The other thing is that there's a lot of clear-cut locks on the Patriots roster, and now that you eliminate Wynn from the roster, what do they do with that roster spot? Do they keep an additional offensive lineman? Do they choose to just keep 8 offensive linemen and keep a guy like Keontae Davis or someone else moving forward? I guess let's start off with the offensive line, because I think they can keep 8. I think that if I were the Patriots, I would probably only keep 8 players, and that would be the starters, which is Trent Brown at left tackle, Joe Thuney at left guard, David Andrews at center, Shaq Mason at right guard, and Marcus Cannon, assuming he's healthy, at right tackle.
Cannon's health is going to be a bit of a wild card in this.
Definitely. And then you've got Adrian Waddle as your top offensive tackle backup. You've got Ted Karras as your top interior line backup. And then you've got Cole Croston, who's an interesting player who can play tackle or guard. Now, if they don't like Cole Croston enough to keep him aboard, then maybe they have to keep 2 additional players, where it would be Ulrich John or Matt Tobin at offensive tackle, and then maybe another interior offensive lineman like Brian Schwenke or Luke Bowenko or someone else of that ilk. I guess while talking about Tobin, he does have experience at guard as well, but we've mostly seen him at tackle, feels like, throughout this summer. So I don't know. What do you think what do you think they do, and what do you think they should do?
Well, I do think they're in a much better position this year than they were at this point last year with their O-line depth.
Definitely.
Because last year they went in basically saying, we'll have Cameron Fleming and Adrian Waddle and a bunch of brand new guys almost, and Ted Karras, who was in his second year then. This year it's a lot different. The Bill Belichick strategy earlier this offseason was, let's bring in some veteran offensive line talent, guys who obviously were never kind of superstars anywhere else because they wouldn't have been available for this little money, but they have a ton of experience in that unit now. I believe their backup offensive linemen have 265 games of NFL experience. At this time last year, that number was 122, including 6 rookies, 4 UDFAs. So they have a lot of people who have played in the NFL at least before. Croston, I think, probably is the most likely guy to slide in there because the Patriots obviously liked him enough to keep him on their roster all last season as an undrafted rookie, even though he didn't play that much. It does kind of concern me that Croston didn't get into the game at all against Philadelphia last week, even though there was an injury to Ulrich John. Once Ulrich John got hurt, they ended up putting Adrian Waddle back in. They've used Croston mostly as a guard this summer, so he's a guy that can play both, but it's kind of hard to judge right now how confident they are in him in either of those spots. I do think a guy like Matt Tobin seems to be probably I'd probably put him at the top of those 4 between him, Ulrich John, Schwenke, and Luke Bowenko, but they are all kind of slightly different players, so it's a little bit difficult to judge. I'm interested to see how how they deploy that O-line rotation this week, because the third preseason game, you usually see these guys play pretty deep into games. But will you see Landry and Waddle play those whole first 3 quarters or whatever, or are you going to see some rotation in there? Because with Marcus Cannon, we haven't seen him on the practice field for about 3 weeks now, so we don't even know if he's going to be healthy at the beginning of the season. So a lot of kind of uncertainty on this offensive line. It does seem like they have options. I don't know. What would you do if you were in this situation?
I would go with the 8. I still like Croston. It was interesting they didn't play in that game, but maybe they just wanted to give some other guys opportunities. It was odd that Waddle came in over Croston, but maybe they just decided to give Croston the whole game off and didn't want to switch things up on him there once Ulrich John got hurt. But I don't know. I kind of like their options there. I've seen other people float out the idea that the Patriots could acquire another backup offensive lineman, but I don't know. I mean, Ulrich John has played well. Matt Tobin has played well. I haven't had any major complaints about the other interior offensive line options like Schwenke and Bowenko. So I don't know. I think that I'd certainly keep the pieces that they have in place already, and I'd probably just roll with 8 offensive linemen. It is a little bit tough that this year, I don't know what the practice squad eligibility of guys like Tobin or John is. Yeah, I would be surprised if they have eligibility.
I can't imagine they do, because they've been around the league for so long.
Yeah, so I could look that up, but it would be tough right now. So yeah, if they do keep only 8, then you're talking about having your depth on the practice squad, which they don't really have a great candidate for that at this point. So I don't know. It'll certainly be interesting to see what they do there. So I would keep 8 and then keep an additional player, whether it's Cyrus Jones as a punt returner, Keontae Davis as a pass rusher, maybe one of the other young cornerbacks. But like you said, Marcus Cannon, extra linebacker maybe. The Marcus Cannon injury situation is certainly notable too, because it feels like at this point the Patriots will probably be adding Harvey Longy to their injured reserve list, and that would have to come after the Patriots create their initial 53-man roster. So Longy would have to make the initial 53-man roster before being placed on injured reserve. The same thing would have to happen to Marcus Cannon if for some reason he was hitting injured reserve. But we saw him in the locker room yesterday and didn't seem like he was limping at all.
Fine, yeah.
He seemed fine. He briefly talked to a reporter, didn't answer any questions, but he was around. So it seems like he might be coming back sooner than later.
My bigger concern with Cannon is not that he would miss time early in the season, which he still could, considering he hasn't been back at practice, but that if they have that fear or that concern that he's going to be injured again, he's already left practice with 2 separate ailments so far this offseason. If they have a concern that he's not going to hold up, they need another guy there that they're confident in, that is a guy who is maybe not less of a developmental guy and more of a guy that can play right now if they need to, because we saw their tackle depth tested last year. They were lucky that Landry and Waddle and Cameron Fleming were both able to handle that job. There's a situation where they could end up having to do that again this season. So it's definitely some questions that they're going to have to be answered. Yeah.
So let's get into this week's preseason game somewhat briefly against the Panthers. What are we watching for in this game? I think that, let's go offense first. I would say wide receiver, just because there are certainly still some questions there. I think that, and it still seems unlikely that we'll see Kenny Britt play in this game. We haven't been able to watch full practices now that the training camp is officially over, so we don't know what Kenny Britt's status in practice is, if he's still limited, how much he's participating. But if he does play, that would be huge, because we get to see what he looks like with Tom Brady. If he doesn't, then we'll see if Eric Decker has figured out how to catch a pass yet. We'll see if Philip Dorsett can maybe start to make some more plays out there. And we'll have to see if some of the younger guys like Braxton Berrios or Riley McCarron can begin to step up and maybe try to push for a roster spot in these last 2 weeks, because they really haven't done much to, push for a roster spot at this point in the summer.
Yeah, I think Britt's the guy that I'm really going to be watching here if he does end up getting into this game, because both of us have heard that the Patriots have big plans for Kenny Britt this season, that he's going to be a significant portion of their offense if he's healthy. He just hasn't been healthy. I mean, we talked to him the other day for the first time all summer, for the first time since he suffered that hamstring injury back in June, And he said that it's still not completely better. There are good days and there are bad days. Some days, he said some days he goes out there and he's faster than he's been all year. Some days he goes out there and his hamstring's just kind of popping, which obviously is not a very good sign. And so, I mean, I did see him come back into the locker room with grass stains on his practice jersey yesterday. So who knows if that means that he's been kind of upping his workload. This is some amateur detective work from Zack Cox. But yeah, so he's going to need to, I think
he also came in with his daughter yesterday.
True. She was very cute.
Yeah.
But I think I don't know. Who knows whether how the internal conversations are going with this, but you have to imagine the Patriots expected and wanted Kenny Britt to be back on the field by this point, or he is back on the field, but back in a full role and ready to fully participate in practice and play in these games. So maybe he has returned to that level this week. Maybe he will return to that level this week. Maybe we'll see him in this third preseason game or in next week's preseason finale. But it's hard to keep him. It's hard to pencil him into the roster when we haven't seen anything from him and we don't know if he's going to get healthy in time for the season.
Yeah, I mean, I would still expect him to make the roster just because of the limited bodies that they have there. And like you said, we've heard that Patriots have big plans for him. I'm not sure if that's actually the case, but we'll see. I don't know. I mean, gauging the other options that they have there, Eric Decker hasn't impressed. Philip Dorsett hasn't really impressed. Like I said, McCarron, Barrios haven't really impressed. Devin Lucien slowed down. So I would throw him in there just because he's a big-bodied receiver who has a lot of NFL experience.
Yeah, there's really not a ton of kind of quality depth behind Chris Hogan and Julian Edelman. No. Edelman's obviously not going to be there for the first month. So they need somebody to step up in there.
Let's get into the cornerbacks again real quick. I think that the real thing that we're watching for is if guys like Jonathan Jones, who, like you said, had that injury last year, Cyrus Jones, who had the torn ACL last August, if they can get into this game, Duke Dawson as well, Ryan Lewis, who seemed like he had a minor injury that he was kind of working through. Because, I mean, everyone has good reason to be down on Keon Cross and Jamal Wiltz, maybe even J.C. Jackson, maybe even Jason McCourty after that last preseason game. So I certainly would like to see Jonathan Jones, Cyrus Jones, Ryan Lewis, these guys start to step up a little bit just to give us a better gauge of this cornerback group. I mean, Cyrus Jones, I know what Patriots fans think of him because he had so much trouble returning punts during his rookie season. He had the whole lost 2017 season, but it feels like there's still an opportunity for him to make an impact and to make this team this year, but he just has to get on the field in order to do it, because if he's out there returning punts, if he can prove that he can field a punt correctly, if he can maybe start to make an impact in the slot a little bit, then he really has a decent chance of making this team and possibly making an impact.
I agree. And really just because Riley McCarron and Braxton Berrios have not impressed at all. I mean, both of them have had their moments, but it takes a long time for these slot receivers sometimes to develop, and I don't think either of them are at the point where they could contribute to the Patriots on offense or really on special teams. I mean, maybe they could catch punts without dropping them, but you're not going to have them back there as kind of big play threats. So I think if you could get Cyrus Jones into that spot, I mean, he looked pretty good last summer before he got hurt. He's been, I mean, fine with what we've seen so far. We haven't seen that much of him, but if he can get back into that spot, I think he does have a very good chance of making this team. He's got to get back on the field first. He was a second-round pick 2 years ago. I don't think they want to give up on him just yet. It does seem like he's put in the necessary work to kind of get himself back there. But that's why we got to see all these cornerbacks on the field so we can kind of properly judge how this whole situation is going to shake out.
Absolutely. I think that will do it for us this week. The WEI NESN Jimmy Fund Telethon is going on right now. Easiest way to donate is to text K-Cancer to 20222. That would do a $25 donation. You can also go to the Jimmy Fund website to donate. But any help would be great. That telethon's always, a fun part of every summer as the preseason and training camp starts to wind down here.
Absolutely. And even if the telethon happens to be over by the time you listen to this, you can always just go to jimmyfund.org and make any kind of donation that you want. Like Doug said, anything would be much appreciated. This is one of the best events that us and the folks over at WEI run all year. So anything you can give, much appreciated.
Absolutely. And always follow us on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @DougKyed. Zach's is @ZackCoxNESN. And keep it on NESN.com for all of your Patriots coverage.